Zebulun, Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hello, this is John. This is the Abracast. I'm John. We're going to be picking right up and continuing with our look at the creature from Jekyll Island. So the reason that we're doing this book is because I believe that in the coming months, in the not too distant future, we're going to be hearing a lot about the Federal Reserve, and I thought it would be interesting if we could kind of know where it comes from, what it does, why it's here. This book, A Creature from Jekyll Island, A Second Look at the Federal Reserve, is written by G. Edward Griffin. The next part here is called The Bankers Utopia. Speaking of utopias, if all banks could be forced to issue loans in the same ratio to their reserves as other banks did, then regardless of how small that ratio was, the amount of checks to be cleared between them would balance in the long run. No major currency drains would ever occur. The entire banking industry might collapse under such a system. But not individual banks, at least not those that were part of the cartel. All would walk the same distance from the edge, regardless of how close it was. Under such a uniformity, no individual bank could be blamed for failure to meet its obligations. The blame could be shifted instead to the economy, or the government policy, or interest rates, or trade deficits, or the exchange value of the dollar, or even the capitalist system itself. But in 1910, such a banker's utopia had not yet been created. If the downtown bank began to loan at a greater ratio to its reserves than its competitors, the amount of checks which would come back to it for payment would also be greater. Thus, the bank which pursued more reckless lending policy had to draw against its reserves in order to make payments to the more conservative banks, and when those funds were exhausted, it usually was forced into bankruptcy. Historian John Klein tells us that the financial panics of 1873, 1884, 1893, and 1907 were a large part an outgrowth of reserve pyramiding and excessive deposit creation by reserve city banks. These panics were triggered by the currency drains that took place in periods of relative prosperity, when banks were loaned up. In other words, the panics and resulting bank failures were caused not by negative factors in the economy, but by currency drains on the banks, which were loaned up to the point where they had practically no reserves at all. The banks did not fail because the system was weak. The system failed because the banks were weak. This was another common problem that brought these 7 men over 1,000 miles to a tiny island off the shore of Georgia. Each was potentially a fierce competitor, but uppermost in their minds were the so-called panics and the very real 1,748 bank failures of the preceding 2 decades. Somehow they had to join forces. The method had to be devised to enable them to continue to make more promises, to pay on demand, and they could keep. To do this, they had to find a way to force all banks to walk the same distance from the edge. And when the inevitable disasters happened, to shift public blame away from themselves by making it appear to be a problem of the national economy rather than of private banking practice, the door then could be open for the use of tax money rather than their own funds paying off the loans. We should be, in the back of our minds, we should be hearing bailouts, too big to fail, all this kind of stuff that we heard about TARP and just about every other stimulus package since then. Here, then, were the main challenges that faced that tiny but powerful group assembled on Jekyll Island. 1. How to stop the growing influence of small rival banks and to ensure that control over the nation's financial resources would remain in the hands of those present. 2. How to make money supply more elastic in order to reverse the trends of private capital formation and to recapture the industrial loan market. 3. How to pull the meager services of the nation's banks into one large reserve so that all banks will be motivated to follow the same loan-to-deposit ratios. This would protect at least some of them from currency drains and bank runs. Should this lead eventually to the collapse of the whole banking system, then how to shift losses from the owners of the banks to the taxpayers? Interesting. I started the last episode out talking about FedEx versus the mail, the U.S. Postal Service. The cartel adopts a name. Branding. This is the power of branding. Everyone knew that the solution to problems was a cartel mechanism that had been devised and already put into similar operation in Europe. As with all cartels, it had been created by legislation and sustained by the power of government under the deception of protecting the consumers. The most important task before them, therefore, could be stated as objective number 5. How to convince Congress that the scheme was a measure to protect the public. The task was a delicate one. The American people did not like the concept of a cartel. The idea of business enterprising joining together to fix prices and prevent competition was alien to the free enterprise system. It could never be sold to the voters. But if the word cartel was not used, if this venture could be described with words which are emotionally neutral, perhaps even alluring, then half of the battle would be won. The first decision, therefore, was to follow the practice adopted in Europe. Henceforth, the cartel would operate as a central bank. And even that was to be a generic expression for purposes of public relations and legislation. They would devise a name that would avoid the word bank altogether and would would conjure the image of the federal government itself. Furthermore, to create the impression that there would be no concentration of power, they would establish regional branches of the cartel to make that a main selling point. Stevenson tells us Aldrich entered this discussion at Jekyll Island an ardent convert to the idea of a central bank. His desire was to transplant the system of one of the great European banks, say the Bank of England, bodily to America. The political expediency required that such plans be concealed from the public. As John Kenneth Galbraith said, it was Aldrich's, thought to outflank the opposition by having not one central bank, but many, and the word bank would itself be avoided. With the exception of Aldrich, all of those present were bankers. But only one was an expert in the European model of the central bank. Because of this knowledge, Paul Warburg became the dominant and guiding mind through all of the discussions. Even a casual pursual of the literature of the creation of the Federal Reserve System is sufficient to find what he was indeed the cartel's mastermind. Galbraith says, Warburg has, with some justice, been called the father of the system. Professor Edwin Siegelman, a member of the international banking family of the J&W Siegelmans, the head of the Department of Economics at Columbia University, writes, in its fundamental features, the Federal Reserve Act is the work of Mr. Warburg more than any other man in the country. Is the real daddy Warbucks. Paul Moritz Warburg was the leading member of the investment banking firm M.M. Warburg and Company of Hamburg, Germany, and Amsterdam, the Netherlands. He had come to the United States only 9 years previously. Soon after the arrival, however, and with funding provided mostly by the Rothschilds Group, he and his brother Felix had been able to buy a partnership in New York investment banking firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and while continuing as partners, Warburg of Hamburg, within 20 years, Paul would become one of the wealthiest men in America with an unchallenged domination over the country's railroad system. At this distance in history, it is difficult to appreciate the importance of this man, but some understanding may be had from the fact that the legendary character Daddy Warbucks in the comic strip Little Orphan Annie was a contemporary commentary on the presumed benevolence of Paul Warburg and the almost magic ability to accomplish good things through the power of his unlimited wealth. It's a hard knock life for us. That's Annie, right? Is that Annie? I don't fucking know. Or is it Jay-Z? What? The third brother, Max Warburg, was the financial advisor of the Kaiser and became director of the Reichsbank in Germany. This, of course, was a central bank, and it was one of the cartel models used in the construction of the Federal Reserve System. This Reichsbank, incidentally, a few years later, would create the massive hyperinflation that occurred in Germany, wiping out the middle class and the entire German economy as well. Paul Warburg soon became well known on Wall Street as the persuasive advocate for a central bank in America. 3 years before the Jekyll Island meeting, he had published several pamphlets. One was entitled Defects and Needs of Our Banking System, and the other was A Plan for a Modified Central Bank. These attracted wide attention in both financial and, of course, academic circles, and set the intellectual climate for all future discussions regarding banking legislation. The treatises Warburg complained that the American monetary system was crippled by its dependency on gold government bonds, both of which were limited supply. What America needed, he argued, was an elastic money supply that could be expanded and contracted to accommodate the influctuating needs of commerce. The solution, he said, was to follow the German example whereby banks could create currency slowly on the basis of commercial paper, which is banker language for IOUs from corporations. Warburg was tireless in his efforts. He was a featured speaker before scores of influential audiences. He wrote a steady stream of published articles on the subject. In March of that year, for example, the New York Times published an 11-part series written by Warburg explaining and expounding what he called the Reserve Bank of the United States. So this Reichsbank business that they were talking about, his brother Max Warburg, this is the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, Weimar Germany. You'll hear stories, and if you look at it, you'll see, these little old ladies pushing wheelbarrows full of money around because it's like cost, 3 kajillion Deutschmarks to get a loaf of bread because of the hyperinflation. Just to add a little context to that. The message was plain for all those who understood. Most of Warburg's writings and lecturings on this topic was eyewash for the public, to cover the fact that central bank is merely a cartel which has been legalized. Its proponents had to lay down a thick smokescreen of technical jargon, focusing away on how it would supposedly benefit commerce, the public, and the nation, and how it would lower interest rates, provide funding for needed industrial projects, prevent panics in the economy. There was not the slightest glimmer that underneath it all was a master plan, which was designed from top to bottom to serve the private interests at the expenses of public. So when we hear this, like supposedly the benefit of the commerce, the public, and the taxpayers, in the back of my mind, all I can hear is Obama, shovel-ready jobs. It's the infrastructure. It's like, how often do we have to fund infrastructure on a federal level? Apparently, we have to do it quite often. Shovel-ready jobs. This was nevertheless the cold reality, and the more perceptive bankers were all aware of it. In addition, before the American Bankers Association the following year, Aldrich laid it out for anyone who was really listening to the meaning of his words. He said, "The organization proposed is not a bank, but a cooperative union of all of the banks of the country for definitive purposes, precisely a union of banks." 2 years later, in a speech, he gave the same group of bankers, I was going to say spankers. A. Barton Hepburn of Chase National Bank was even more candid when he said, "The measure recognizes and adopts the principles of a central bank indeed. If it works out as the sponsors of the law hope, it will make all incorporated banks together joint owners of a central dominating power." It is about as good a definition of a cartel as one is likely to find. Now, in 1914, 1 year after the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law, Senator Aldrich could afford to be less guarded in his remarks. In an article published in July of that year in a magazine called The Independent, he boasted, "Before the passage of this act, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now we are able to dominate the bank reserves of the entire country." Myth accepted as history. The accepted version of history is that the Federal Reserve was created to stabilize our economy. One of the most widely used textbooks on the subject says it sprang from the panic of 1907. With an alarming epidemic of bank failures, the country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking. Even the most naive student must sense a grave contradiction between this cherished view of the system's actual performance. Since its inception, it has presided over the crashes of 1921 and 1929, the Great Depression of 29, the 39, or the recessions of 53, 57, 69, 75, and 81, a stock market Black Monday in 1987, and a 1,000% inflation, which had destroyed 90% of the dollar's purchasing power. So this is what we're seeing right now with inflation. It's like a secret tax for our leaders being stupid, because our dollar is less. It's the purchase power of our dollar is less, because there's more dollars floating around out there for a limited number of products. So I should preface all this with saying I'm not an economist. I'm awful at math. I'm looking at this from the side of the tagline of the show, the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence. This is the conspiracy part of it. Because, when people talk about the Federal Reserve, when these the tinfoil kind of conspiracy podcast or host talk about the Federal Reserve, they're like, the Federal Reserve, this country is actually a company, and you're like bought and traded like commodities, and the Federal Reserve is the actual, whatever. It's like the company or whatever they say. I don't need to go that far for a conspiracy of the Federal Reserve, because here it is. These 7 motherfuckers locked themselves on an island and hashed out this shit, and like, this is it. This is the conspiracy of the Federal Reserve. I don't need the mark of the beast, However, I am starting to get there. The more and more I hear about this Federal Reserve Digicoin, maybe we'll talk about it. I'm sorry for getting off track. Here we go. Let us be more specific on the last point. By 1990, an annual income of $10,000 was required to buy what took only $1,000 in 1914. That incredible loss of value was quietly transferred to the federal government in the forms of hidden taxation, and the Federal Reserve System was the mechanism by which that was accomplished. I remember when I was a kid, I don't know what it was, but I got in my hands, I know what it was. I was reading my dad's comic books. He's got some pretty old comic books, and I was like reading comic books, and I seen like an ad for, I was about to say an advertisement, an ad for something that I was familiar with, and something that I knew cost more than what I was looking at the ad was. So I don't know if it was like, the ad where the wimpy kid gets sand kicked in his face, so he like buys the book that teaches him how to like get buff, so he could go and kick sand on the other guy's face. Like in 1962, that thing costs like 50 cents, that book, according to the ad. And like when I was reading it in like 1980, it was like $5 or something. So this is comic book economics. Here we go. 101 by Dr. John Towers. So I remember talking to my dad about it. And I remember him saying stuff like, well, over time things get more expensive and yada, yada, yada. And I remember just being perplexed, like being like, well, if that's true, like everything's going to wind up costing $1 million, right? And he was like, no. There's like stuff put in place so that doesn't happen. Well, longtime listeners of the show will know that my dad is like a Maoist-style communist. So maybe he's in on this whole thing that's happening to us right now. Again, I apologize for rambling. Actions have consequences. The consequences of wealth confiscation by the Federal Reserve mechanism are now upon us. In the current decade, corporate debt is soaring. Personal debt is greater than ever. Both business and personal bankruptcies are at an all-time high. Banks are saving and loan associations are failing in large numbers than ever before. Interest on the national debt is consuming half of our tax dollars. That's just the interest. That's just the interest payments. I don't know when this book was written. It really really shouldn't take me this long to find this. Copyright 94. So in 1994, they were paying half of the tax dollars to the interest on the national debt. It's got to be 100% now. It's got to be like an order of magnitude higher than that at this point in time. Heavy industry has been largely replaced by overseas competitors. We are facing an international trade deficit for the first time in our history. 75% of downtown Los Angeles and other metropolitan areas are now owned by foreigners, and the other half is being occupied by homeless people. And over half of our nation is in a state of economic recession. So what was going on in 1994? Bill Clinton, old Slick Willie. The first reason to abolish the system. That is the scorecard 80 years after the Federal Reserve was created, supposedly to stabilize our economy. There can be no argument that the system has failed in its stated objectives. Furthermore, after this time, after repeated changes in personnel, after operating under both political parties, after numerous experiments in monetary philosophy, after almost 100 revisions to its charter, and after the development of countless new formulas and techniques, there has been more than ample opportunity to work out a mere procedural flaw. It is not unreasonable to conclude, however, that the system has failed, not because it needs a new set of rules or more intelligent directors, but because it's incapable of achieving its stated objective. It's all bullshit. And if an institution is incapable of achieving its objectives, there is no reason to preserve it, unless it can be altered in some way to change its capability. That leads to the question, why is the system incapable of achieving its stated objectives? The painful answer is that those were never its true objectives. When one realizes the circumstance under which it was created, when one contemplates the identity of those who authored it, and when one studies its actual performance over the years, it becomes obvious that the system is merely a cartel with a government facade. There is no doubt that those who run it are motivated to maintain full employment, high productivity, low inflation, and a general sound economy. I don't even think that that is the case anymore. They are not interested in killing the goose that lays such beautiful golden eggs. I don't believe that anymore. But when there is a conflict between the public interest and the private needs of the cartel, a conflict that arises almost daily, the public will be sacrificed. That is the nature of the beast. It is foolish to expect a cartel to act in any other way. This view is not encouraged by establishment institutions and publishers. Become their apparent mission to convince the American people that the system is not intrinsically flawed. It merely has been in the hands of bumbling oafs, for example. William Grieder was a former assistant managing editor of the Washington Post. His book Secrets of the Temple was published in 1987 by Simon & Schuster. It was critical of the Federal Reserve System because of its failures, but according to Grieder, those were not caused by any defect in the system itself, but merely because of economic factors are so complicated, and that the good men who have struggled to make the system work have just not yet been able to figure it all out. But don't worry, folks. They're working on it. This is exactly the kind of powder puff criticism that is accepted in our mainstream media. I believe they couldn't even say that today without getting deplatformed or some shit like that. Yet Grieder's own research points to an entirely different interpretation. Speaking of the system's origin, he says, as new companies prospered without Wall Street, so did new regional banks that handled their funds. New York's concentrated share of bank deposits is still huge, about half the nation's total, but it was declining steadily. Wall Street was still the biggest kid on the block, but less and less able to bully the others. This trend was a crucial fact of history, a misunderstood reality that completely alters the political meaning of the reform legislation that created the Federal Reserve. At the time, the conventional wisdom in Congress, widely shared and sincerely espoused by progressive reformers, was that a government institution would finally harness the money trust, disarm its powers, and establish broad democratic control over money and credit. The results were nearly the opposite. The Money Reforms Acted in 1913, in fact, helped to preserve the status quo, to stabilize the old order. Money center bankers would not only gain dominance over new central bankers, but would also enjoy new insulation against instability in their own decline. Once the Fed was in operation, the steady diffusion of power, financial power, halted. Wall Street maintained its dominant position and even enhanced it. Anthony Sutton, former research fellow at Hoover Institution for War, Revolution, Peace, and also professor of economics at California State University, Los Angeles, provided a somewhat deeper analysis. Before I get into that, I just want to say, this Anthony Sutton guy, we know him. He's the guy that wrote the book on the Skull and Bones, The Secret Cult of the Order. We did a whole series on that. You can find it on the featured topic link at Abracast.com. You know, this is a weird place to find him. I mean, if you just know him from that, it's interesting. It gives him a little bit of credibility, I think. Spreads it around. So this is what Sutton says. Warburg's revolutionary plan to get American society to go to work for Wall Street was astonishingly simple. Even today, academic theoreticians cover their blackboards with meaningless equations, and the general public struggles in bewildered confusion with inflation and coming credit collapse, while quite simple explanation of the problem goes undiscussed and almost entirely uncomprehended. The Federal Reserve System is a large private monopoly of the money supply operated on the benefit of the few under the guise of protecting and promoting public interest. The real significance of the journey to Jekyll Island and the creature that was hatched there was inadvertently summarized by the words of Paul Warburg's admiring biographer Harold Kellick. Paul M. Warburg is probably the mildest-mannered man that ever personally conducted a revolution. It was a bloodless revolution. He did not attempt to rouse the populace to arms. He stepped forth armed simply with an idea, and he conquered. That's an amazing thing. A shy, sensitive man, he imposed his idea on a nation of 100 million people. Oh, it includes pictures of these guys. They all look like dandies or walruses. These 7 fine gentlemen. All right, we're going to dip our toe here into the next section. And I think some of us might have saw this coming. It's called The Name of the Game is Bailout. It was stated in the previous chapter that the Jekyll Island group, which conceived the Federal Reserve System, actually created a national cartel, which was dominated by its larger banks, and was also stated that a primary objective of that cartel was to involve the government as an agent for shifting the inevitable losses from the owners of those banks to the taxpayers. That, of course, is one of the more controversial assertions made in this book, yet there is little room for any other interpretation when one confronts the massive evidence of history since the system was created. Let us, therefore, take another leap through time, having jumped to the year 1910 to begin the story. Now let us return to the present era. To understand how banking losses are shifted to the taxpayers, it is first necessary to know a little bit about the scheme, how the scheme was designed to work. There are certain procedures and formulas which must be understood, or else the entire process seems like chaos. It is as though we had been isolated all our lives on a South Sea island with no knowledge of the outside world. Imagine what it would be like taken to the first time as we travel to the mainland and witness a game of professional football. We would stare with incredulity at the men dressed like aliens from another planet, throwing their bodies against each other, tossing a funny shaped object back and forth, fighting over it as though it were of great value, yet occasionally kicking it out of the area as though it were worthless and despised, chasing each other, knocking each other to the ground, and then walking away to regroup for another surge. All this with tens of thousands of spectators riotously shouting in unison for no apparent reason at all, without a basic understanding of what this was a game, and without knowledge of the rules of the game. This event would appear as total chaos and universal madness. I love this as a guy who is not a football fan at all, and that's had to sit through literally hundreds of football games. I totally agree with what they're saying, and I relate to it. The operation of our monetary system through the Federal Reserve has much in common with professional football. First, there are certain plays that are repeated over and over again with only minor variations to suit the special circumstances. Second, there are definite rules which the players follow, great precision. Third, there is a clear objective to the game which is uppermost in the minds of the players. Fourth, the spectators are not familiar with the objectives and they do not understand the rules. They will never comprehend what's going on, which, as far as monetary matters are concerned, the common state of the vast majority of Americans today. Let us therefore attempt to spell out in plain language what the objective is and how the players expect to achieve it. To demystify the process, we shall present an overview first, after the concepts are clarified, and then we shall follow up with actual examples taken from the... Okay, the name of the game is I'm skipping ahead, is Bailout. As stated previously, the objective of this game is to shift the inevitable losses from the owners of large banks to the taxpayers. This procedure, by which is accomplished, is as follows. The rules of the game. The game begins in the Federal Reserve System, allows commercial banks to create checkbook money out of nothing. The banks derive profit from this easy money, not by spending it, but by lending it to others and collecting interest. When such a loan is placed on the bank's books, it is shown as an asset because it is earning interest and presumably someday will be paid back. At the same time, an equal entry is made on the liability side of the ledger. That is because the newly created checkbook money is now in circulation, and most of it will end up in other banks, which will return the canceled checks to the issuing banks for payment. Individuals may also bring in some of this checkbook money back to the bank and request cash. This issuing bank, therefore, has a potential money payout liability equal to the amount of the loan asset. When borrowers cannot repay and there are no assets which can be taken to compensate, the banks must write off that loan as a loss. However, since most of the money originally has created out of nothing and costs the bank nothing except bookkeeping overhead, there is little of tangible value in the actual loss. It is primarily a bookkeeping entry. A bookkeeping loss can still be undesirable to a bank because it causes the loan to be removed from the ledgers as an asset without a reduction in liabilities. The difference must come from the equity of those who owned the bank. In other words, the loan asset is removed, but the money liability remains. The original checkbook money is still circulating out there, even though the borrower cannot repay. The issuing bank still has an obligation to redeem those checks. The only way to do this and balance the books once again is to draw upon capital which is invested in the bank invested by the bank's stockholders to deduct the loss from the bank's current profits. In either case, the owner of the bank loses an amount equal to the value of the defaulted loan. So to them, the loss becomes very real. If the bank is forced to write off a large amount of bad loans, the amount could exceed the entire value of the owner's equity. When that happens, the game is over. The bank is insolvent. This concern would be sufficient to motivate most bankers to be very conservative in their loan policy. The fact that most of them do act with great caution when dealing with individuals and small businesses, but the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Federal Deposit Loan Corporation now guarantee that massive loans can be made to large corporations and other governments will not be allowed to fall entirely upon the bank's owners should those loans go into default. This is done under the argument that if these corporations or banks are allowed to fail, the nation would suffer from vast unemployment and economic disruption. More of that in a moment. All right, let's get into some of these plays. The perpetual debt play. The end result of this policy is that banks have little motive to be cautious and are not protected against the effect of their own folly. The larger loan, the better it is because it will produce the greatest amount of profit within the least amount of effort. A single loan to a third world country netting hundreds of millions of dollars in annual interest is just as easy to process, if not easier, than a loan for $50,000 to a local merchant in a shopping mall. If the interest is paid, it's gravy time. And the loan defaults, the federal government will protect the public, and through various mechanisms described shortly, will make sure the banks continue to receive their interest. Skipping ahead, the debt rollover play. Since the system makes it profitable for banks to make large, unsound loans, that is the kind of loans which banks will make. Furthermore, it is predictable that most unsound loans will eventually go into default. When a borrower finally declares that he cannot pay, the bank responds by rolling over the loan. This is often a stage managed to appear as a concession on the part of the bank, but in reality, it is a significant forward move towards the objective of perpetual interest. The up the ante play. Skipping ahead. Sooner or later, the borrower becomes restless and he is not interested in making interest payments with nothing left for himself. He comes to realize that he's merely working for the bank, and once again, interest payments stop. The opposing teams go into a huddle and plan the next move, then rush to the scrimmage. The scrimmage line, where they hurl threatening innuendos at each other, and the borrower simply cannot or will not pay. Collect if you can. The lender threatens to blackball the borrower to see to it that he will never again be able to obtain a loan. Finally, a compromise is worked out. As before, the bank agrees to create still more money out of nothing and lend that to the borrower to cover up the interest on both of the previous loans. But at this time, they up the ante and provide still additional money for the borrower to spend on something other than interest. That's the perfect score. The borrower suddenly has a fresh supply of money for his purpose, plus enough to keep making those bothersome interest payments. That bank, on the other hand, still has larger assets, higher interest income, and greater profits. What an exciting game. The rescheduling play. The previous plays can be repeated several times until the reality finally dawns on the borrower that he is sinking deeper and deeper into the debt pit with no prospects of climbing out. This realization usually comes when the interest payments become so large they represent almost as much as the entire corporate earnings or the country's total tax base. This time around, rollovers with large loans are rejected and the default seems inevitable. Skipping ahead, the protect the public play. Eventually, the day of reckoning arrives. The borrower realizes that he can never repay the capital that flatly refuses to pay interest on it. This time is for the final maneuver. According to the Banking Safety Digest, which specializes in rating the safety of Americans' banks and S&Ls, savings and loans, most of the banks involved with problem loans are quite profitable businesses. Note that except for third world loans, most of the large banks in the country are operating quite profitably, in contrast with the continually working savings and loans crisis. The bank's profitability has been an engine in which they have been working off, albeit slowly, their overseas debt. At last year's profitability levels, the bank's industry could, in theory, buy out the entirety of their own Latin American loans within 2 years. The banks can absorb these losses of their bad loans to multinational corporations, foreign governments, but that it is not according to the rules. It would be a major loss to the stockholders, who would receive little or no dividends during the adjustment period. And any chief executive officer who embarked upon such a course would soon be looking for a new job. This is not part of the game plan, is evident by the fact that while a small portion of the Latin American debt has been absorbed, the banks are continuing to make gigantic loans to the governments in other parts of the world, particularly Africa, Red China, the Eastern European nations, for reasons which will be analyzed, yada, yada, yada. Okay, here's how it works. The captains of both teams approach the referee and the game commissioner to request that the game be extended. The reason given is that this is in the interest of the public. These spectators, who are having such a wonderful time and who will be sad to see the game ended, they request also that while the spectators are in the stadium enjoying themselves, the parking lot attendants are ordered to quietly remove the hubcaps from every car. This can be sold to provide money for the additional salaries for all the players, including the referees and, of course, the commissioner himself. And that is only fair since they are now working overtime for the benefit of the spectators. Which the deal is finally struck. The horn will blow 3 times, and a roar of joyous relief will sweep across the stadium. The guaranteed payment play, skipping back ahead. One of the standard variations of the final maneuver is for the government not always to directly provide the funds, but to provide the credit for the funds, the means to guarantee future payments should the borrower again default. Once Congress agrees to this, the government becomes a co-signer to the loan, and the inevitable losses are finally lifted from the ledger of the bank and placed onto the backs of American taxpayers. Prosperity through insolvency. Large corporate loans are often guaranteed by federal government. One would think that the banks which make those loans would never have a problem, yet many of them still manage to bungle themselves into insolvency. As we shall see in a later section, it's inherent to the system, a system called financial reserve banking. Skipping ahead, the FDIC play. The FDIC guarantees that every insured deposit will be paid back regardless of the financial conditions of the bank. The money to do this comes out of a special fund which is derived from assessments against participating banks. The banks, of course, do not pay this assessment. As with all other expenses, the bulk of this cost ultimately is passed on to their customers in the form of higher service fees and lower interest rates on deposits. So that's it. That's the second part of the most diabolical duck hunt in the history of mankind. I'm John Towers. This is the Abracast. I hope you're enjoying this, and we'll see where we go from here with the Federal Reserve. Do 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 do.
thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past, put your present in context, and know your future with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot card deck. Your body is your temple. So let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult themed t-shirts. And other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes. More bonus audio. Additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com.